These forgotten Cabover trucks are now worth serious money. Intro. Picture this. An old Cabover is sitting behind a barn somewhere in America. Faded paint, flat tires, grass growing around the frame. Most people would see an abandoned truck. A collector might see something else entirely. Because hidden among the Cabovers America forgot are trucks that enthusiasts are now willing to spend tens of thousands of dollars to own. And sometimes the valuable part isn't the engine. It isn't the mileage. It isn't even the badge. It's one detail most people would never think to look for. That becomes important later. But first, look at this old Ford. Because not long ago, trucks like this were being worked to death. Now people are bidding real money to save them. Number 10, Ford CL9000. If you drove American highways in the late 1970s or 1980s, a Ford badge on a heavy truck wasn't unusual. But today, mention the CL9000 to someone outside the old-school trucking world, and there's a good chance they'll have no idea what you're talking about. That wasn't always the case. The CL9000 was Ford's serious entry into the premium Class 8 Cabover market, and it looked exactly like a truck from an era when Cabovers still made perfect sense. Flat face, tall windshield, driver sitting almost directly above the front axle. Engine buried under a cab that had to tilt forward for major service. It was a machine designed around one basic priority: put as much trailer as possible behind the tractor while staying within America's length rules. Nobody was thinking about preserving one. These were tools. They hauled freight. They accumulated enormous mileage. And when their useful commercial life ended, many owners simply moved on. That's why the Ford CL9000 has become much more interesting today. In 2022, for example, a 1985 CL9000 offered through Musser Brothers attracted 139 bids and reached $26,500. That's not Ferrari money. But think about what we're talking about. A nearly 4-decade-old commercial truck from a model line that was once treated as ordinary equipment generated more than $26,000 at auction. And the key word is survivor. An original CL9000 with the correct cab, period equipment, recognizable paint scheme, and a usable drivetrain is becoming harder to stumble across. Because unlike collector cars, most of these trucks weren't protected. They worked until somebody decided they weren't worth fixing anymore. That pattern is going to repeat throughout this story. But the next truck makes the disappearance even more obvious, because for a generation of American drivers, it was almost impossible to miss. Number 9, GMC Astro 95. Look at an old photograph of a major American truck stop from the 1970s. There's a good chance you'll spot one, maybe more than one. The GMC Astro 95 was one of those trucks that seemed completely normal when it was new. And that's exactly why seeing one today feels so different. GMC produced the Astro from 1969 through the 1987 model year at Pontiac, Michigan. For nearly 2 decades, it represented General Motors in the heavy-duty Cabover fight. You could find Astros with Cummins power, Caterpillar power, Detroit diesel power, and depending on the owner, almost every kind of working configuration imaginable. They hauled freight. They became flatbeds, dump trucks, farm trucks, local workhorses. And that second life is important, because when a highway tractor stopped being useful for long-haul work, it didn't necessarily disappear immediately. A farmer might buy it, a construction company might use it around a yard, someone might convert it. That kept some Astros alive. But it also meant many surviving trucks slowly lost the features collectors want most today. Original sleepers disappeared, frames were changed, paint was replaced, interiors were torn apart. And decades later, that makes an intact Astro much more interesting than it once was. Recent auction records still show high-mileage Astros surfacing, including a 1975 sleeper truck showing more than 418,000 miles and a 1979 truck showing nearly 588,000. Those mileages tell the real story. These trucks weren't sitting in climate-controlled buildings waiting to appreciate. They were earning their keep. And that's why an old Astro with the right look can stop people at a truck show today. Not because it was exotic, because it wasn't. It reminds veteran drivers of a time when trucks like this were part of the landscape. But nostalgia gets even stronger when the badge on the front carries one of the biggest names in American trucking. Number 8. Mack F-series. There are truck brands people recognize, and then there's Mack. For generations of American drivers, the Bulldog wasn't decoration. It meant something. Toughness, heavy work, a truck expected to survive abuse. So when Mack introduced its F-model Cabover in 1962, it wasn't simply following a trend. It was putting the Mack identity into one of the most important truck configurations of the era. Mack's own history describes the F-model as an all-steel sleeper and non-sleeper cab-over engine truck introduced in 1962. And compared with some cab-overs that relied heavily on outside components, Mack could offer trucks built around much more of its own mechanical identity. Mack engines, Mack transmissions in many configurations, Mack axles. That mattered to drivers who were loyal to the brand. But here's the problem for collectors today. A reputation for durability can actually work against preservation. When a truck is known for being tough, owners keep working it, and working it, and working it. Instead of retiring a clean example early, fleets often extracted as much useful life as possible. Then the truck moved down the economic ladder, from major fleet to smaller fleet to local work, to farm work, and eventually maybe to a field. The result is that many old Mack F models you see today have stories written all over them. Different doors, replacement engines, repaired corners, faded company names under newer paint. To a collector, that history can be part of the charm. But a complete, period-correct truck? That's another matter. And it reveals something important about this entire market. Old cabovers aren't valuable simply because they're old. Condition matters. Configuration matters. History matters, and originality can matter enormously. Which brings us to a truck that proves the opposite side of this market, because some genuine old cabovers are still surprisingly cheap. Number 7. International Transstar 24070. If every old cabover were suddenly worth a fortune, this story would be easy. But it wouldn't be true. The International Transstar 2 is a perfect example. To veteran truckers, a 4070 can be instantly recognizable. International's big COE was a serious highway truck, and examples were available with engines and transmissions that defined the period. Today, surviving Transstar 407s still appear at auction. Some carry extraordinary mileage. A 1978 Transstar 2 Eagle offered in 2025 showed more than 733,000 miles. Another 1974 example showed more than 874,000. Those numbers alone should tell you what these trucks were built to do. But now look at the other side. A 1968 International Transstar 407 sold through a Wyoming consignment auction in 2025 for just $1,600 after 45 bids. So how can we talk about cabovers becoming collectible when one can still sell for less than the price of a worn-out compact car? Because age is only the beginning. Imagine two Transstar 2s. The first has sat outside for 20 years. The interior is gone, the drivetrain is questionable, the tires are ancient, the wiring has been modified by 5 different owners. And getting it home requires a truck, trailer, and a very understanding spouse. Now imagine another example. Original sleeper, period paint, correct badges, strong running Cummins or Detroit, good interior, documented history, usable brakes, good tires. Suddenly you're not comparing the same thing at all, and restoration costs can exceed the purchase price very quickly. Paint on a full-size cabover isn't cheap. Chrome isn't cheap. Interior work isn't cheap. Mechanical work definitely isn't cheap. So collectors often pay more for the truck somebody else already saved. That's the first major lesson here. You're not paying for an old truck. You're paying for how much of that old truck survived. And the next cabover takes that idea even further, because its badge represents an earlier chapter of a company that still dominates American highways today. Number 6. White Freightliner. Before Freightliner became one of the biggest names on American highways, there was a period when the badge read something different. White Freightliner. And today, that name alone can make an old Cabover far more interesting to collectors. These trucks came from a time when Cabovers weren't nostalgic. They were practical. Freight companies wanted maximum trailer length without exceeding strict overall length limits. And the Cabover layout solved that problem beautifully. So white Freightliners went to work. Hard. They pulled freight across the country, piled on enormous mileage, changed owners, changed engines, changed paint, and often kept working long after newer trucks had replaced them on the interstate. That's why truly clean survivors are difficult to find now. A rough example may still be worth only a few $1,000s, but restored trucks tell a very different story. In 2025, a restored 1974 white Freightliner attracted bidding up to $40,000 on Bring a Trailer, although it did not meet reserve. And that gap reveals what collectors are really paying for. Not just age, they're paying for original, trim, period-correct details, straight bodywork, proper badging, and years of restoration someone else has already completed. Because with a white Freightliner, you're not simply saving an old truck. You're saving a chapter of Freightliner history that disappeared with the badge itself. Number 5. Freightliner FLA. By the time Freightliner's FLA generation Cabovers were working American roads, the industry was already changing. Conventional tractors were becoming more attractive. Length regulations had evolved. Driver comfort mattered more. Aerodynamics mattered more. And Cabovers were slowly losing the regulatory advantage that helped make them so common in the first place. That should have made the FLA forgettable. Instead, it gave the truck another kind of appeal. For younger collectors, the FLA represents the final decades when a true American highway Cabover could still feel normal. For older drivers, it can represent the truck they actually worked in. And there's a big difference between admiring a historic truck and remembering the sound of one at 5 in the morning. A classic Freightliner Cabover may bring back the bark of a Detroit diesel, the pull of a big Cummins, the movement of a manual shifter, the sensation of sitting almost on top of the steer axle while the entire cab rocked over rough pavement. That last detail matters. Cabovers were efficient packaging. They were not always gentle. A driver sat much farther forward than in a long-nose conventional. The ride could be punishing. Getting into the sleeper could involve climbing around an engine tunnel, and major service often meant tilting the entire cab. Those were compromises drivers accepted because the truck made sense for the rules of the time. Today, those same quirks are part of the experience people remember. That emotional connection helps explain why cleaner FLA-era trucks have become more desirable. They're not ancient enough to feel like museum pieces. They're old enough to feel mechanical, analog, recognizable, and increasingly uncommon in daily American service. But the next truck tells an even clearer story, because it came from one of the last generations of American Cabovers built while the market was already moving away from them. Number 4, International 9670. A collector vehicle becomes more interesting when it marks the end of something. The International 9670 does exactly that. International introduced the CO 9670 in 1981 as the replacement for the Transstar II. It was wider, more modern, better suited to a new generation of interstate trucking, and it became part of International's 9000 series COE family. But while International kept improving the Cabover, America was changing around it. The regulatory environment that once gave Cabover such an important advantage was no longer the same. Long-nose conventionals could offer better ride quality, easier engine access, more sleeper space, and the look many owner-operators preferred. Cabovers didn't vanish overnight. They faded. That's what makes this generation fascinating. International continued building 9000 series COEs in North America until 1998. Think about that. By the late 1990s, the American interstate was already dominated by trucks that looked much more like today's conventionals. Yet International was still producing a machine whose basic layout belonged to another chapter of trucking. And that's where collector interest becomes less about raw age. A late American Cabover represents the end of an era. If you own one, you're not simply owning another old tractor. You're preserving one of the final examples of a layout that had once been central to American long-haul trucking. That's powerful, because scarcity isn't always about low production. Sometimes scarcity is about an entire category disappearing. And after cabovers vanished from mainstream American fleets, two names began standing above almost everything else in the enthusiast world. One of them was Peterbilt. Number 3, Peterbilt 362. Here's where the numbers start getting attention. As of August 2026, advertised Peterbilt 362 sleeper trucks on Tractor House range from $48,750 to $129,900. Read that again. Up to $129,900 for a cabover. Now that's an asking price. It does not mean every 362 is worth that. It does not mean one actually changed hands for that figure. But the fact that sellers are even positioning certain 362s at that level tells you how far the market has moved. So why the 362? Part of it is the badge. Peterbilt has enormous recognition among American truck enthusiasts. Part of it is the look. A clean 362 has the proportions collectors want from an old-school cabover. Big flat face, tall sleeper options, lots of room for period paint schemes and polished metal. And part of it is simply survival. These trucks were still commercial equipment. 1,000,000 miles was not necessarily the end of their lives. They were rebuilt, repowered, stretched, converted, customized, used in fleets, used by owner-operators, and every modification made a factory-like survivor a little harder to find. That's why mileage can become misleading. If you're buying a modern passenger car, 1,000,000 miles sounds insane. On an old Class 8 truck, the odometer is only part of the story. Has the engine been rebuilt? Was it replaced? What transmission is in it? Is the cab solid? Has the frame been altered? Is the sleeper original? Does the interior still look like a Peterbilt from its period? Can you document where the truck spent its life? Those questions can matter more than the number on the dash. And that's the reason two trucks with the same badge can sit tens of thousands of dollars apart. But if the 362 is desirable, its predecessor may carry even more nostalgia. Number 2, Peterbilt 352. This is where the shape alone can trigger a memory. The Peterbilt 352 has the square, upright face many people picture when they hear the words classic American cabover. And depending on age, configuration, engine, sleeper, restoration, and history, values can be all over the map. In October 2024, Mecum sold a 1972 Peterbilt 352M for $27,500. That truck had a Caterpillar 169 3TA diesel and a 13-speed manual transmission. At the same time, current Peterbilt 352 listings range as high as $54,900. So what makes one worth considerably more than another? This is the insight that matters most in the entire video. Collectors don't simply buy model names, they buy combinations. A desirable engine, a desirable transmission, a sleeper configuration, original aluminum and trim, correct lights, correct mirrors, period paint, good documentation, a body that hasn't spent 40 years dissolving in road salt. And sometimes the most valuable feature is the one that's hardest to recreate. Authenticity. You can install a newer engine, you can paint a truck beautifully, you can polish enough aluminum to blind people at a truck show, but recreating 40 or 50 years of correct details is much harder. Those details disappear, badges disappear, interior panels disappear, original upholstery patterns disappear, factory brackets get thrown away, someone cuts the dash for a radio, someone modifies the sleeper, someone removes an air cleaner. And suddenly restoration becomes archaeology. That's why a truck that looks expensive may actually be cheaper than restoring a cheap one. And it's why the best survivors sometimes command money that would have sounded ridiculous when these machines were just used trucks. But there is one cabover that brings almost every part of this story together. The look, the nostalgia, the owner-operator culture, the long-haul image, and now some extraordinary asking prices. Number 1, Kenworth K100. If one Cabover captures everything collectors miss about old-school American trucking, it may be the Kenworth K100. Not because it was rare when new, quite the opposite. The K100 spent decades earning its reputation the hard way, crossing states, pulling heavy freight, and accumulating the kind of mileage that would destroy most passenger vehicles. Then America changed. Long-nosed conventionals took over, fleets modernized, cabovers were sold, repurposed, or worked until there was almost nothing left worth saving. That is what makes a clean K100 different today, especially in aerodyne. Its raised sleeper roof, huge windshield, flat face, polished tanks, and unmistakable proportions instantly bring back an era when owner-operators could make a truck look completely their own. And collectors are paying attention. Current K100 asking prices range from affordable project trucks to restored or customized examples listed well into six figures. But the highest price isn't really the point. The real value is survival, original trim, period interiors, correct sleeper configurations, old paint schemes, the details that disappeared every time one of these trucks was rebuilt, modified, or scrapped. A K100 doesn't just preserve a machine. It preserves a version of the American highway that no longer exists. And that's exactly why the best survivors are getting harder and more expensive to replace. These trucks didn't become valuable because they suddenly became better machines. They became valuable because the world they belonged to disappeared. And every year, there are fewer original survivors left to tell that story. That's what collectors are really paying for.